This is Candace Richardson Dickens, dope black therapist, clinical therapist, and owner of colortraumahealing.com, a provider directory for BIPOC clients. Before we begin, I just want to remind everyone that if you have someone that you know that was trying to watch this episode and they miss it, it will be recorded again on Facebook and LinkedIn. But they can also go to my YouTube channel at Dope Black Therapist. Please like and subscribe, and that way we can bring you some more content. I wanted to bring to light an issue that I saw that was reported on TV. And I want to make this an opportunity for people to have a conversation and dialogue about what they saw. Recently in Alabama, a dock worker who was responsible for making sure that the tugboats had a space in front of the dock and that the other boats were parked a little bit further away so that the tugboats in the front could move in and out easily. And it seemed as if, he was explaining it to one man, and that man seemed very upset. And then he walked away with his family. And then another man came down in a gray shirt, and he seemed equally as upset. And then somehow, in the midst of this, the first man came back, and with him what looked like adolescents or young people in their 20s. And they physically assaulted the man and caught him by surprise. Um, the uh, the dock worker's African American male, not quite sure the age, but I would say maybe between 25 and 40. So what happened is that once he was struck, they all seemed to pile on him, right, and having him on the ground. Right? And I might be missing something, so I think that once he was struck, that's what it was. He took his hat off, right? And then they all piled on him. And then out of nowhere, you saw a sea of men in color, African American men, who were jumping over the rails, who were running from the side, from the left, from wherever they were coming. And there was even a 16-year-old young man who jumped off a boat and swam his way to that man for rescue and support, to defend his honor, to ensure his safety. And then what began with one man being plummeted by a whole bunch of family members who were Caucasian ended up being an experience where black men came from different places. It was almost like when he took that hat off, it's like the back call, as people say. That it was a moment where he realized that something was going to happen and he had to be ready for it. And I'm not quite sure what happened in each of the men who came to help, but it was symbolic because in that moment, and I am not a supporter of violence, not at all. I think there's always another way to deal with conflict and violence. But I am a supporter of unity, and I am a supporter of anti-racism and stance against oppression. And the fight continued to ensue with the black men who were coming to help this one dock worker. And it went all the way to the ship that the white family was on. And there seemed to be a desire to hold them accountable while the authorities were there. But then there's another thing that happened that was interesting. By the time the police came, they weren't sure the people that were who were the victims and who were the perpetrators. And it took the people there to say, no, 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 it's not the African Americans. It is his white family that assaulted him because there was a presumption that it was these African American guys who had jumped on the boat and was trying to fight the white family because they didn't want them to flee. They wanted them to be held accountable. And they were afraid that they were going to do this behavior someplace else. And what's interesting, people had cameras out. People were saying, it's not right. And people were trying to stop people, and they were fighting. And one of the things that when I invited some of my guests on, because I asked several gentlemen of color to come on the show, some of the things they said was, My, the timing wasn't good. Some people said, I work in an industry where it may not be good for me to be on camera and express how we feel about what happened, right? And then some said, I feel a little bit embarrassed because Candace, before I saw that, I saw the memes. I saw the memes of people play fighting and having a chair and swinging it. And they said, I felt a little bit ashamed because I'm laughing at something. So before I saw the incident, I saw the humor. Right? And the humor allowed them to feel less angry about the injustice that happened. Like there's like a dissonance or a disconnection, as opposed to if you had seen it, there's an upset, there's angry, there's a remembrance of historically of black men and women, including George Floyd, being assaulted and no one stopping it. And for many of us who don't forget, who have forgotten who George Floyd was, this is a man who was being arrested because of some cigarettes and had sat down outside the store and was being taken into the, the police car to go to the station. And he was screaming, I don't want to go. And he was anxious. He was claustrophobic. And people witnessed this man get strangled. And with a lot of recordings that that we've seen over the years, we're witnessing people get harmed. And we're watching people be bystanders. And there's a vicarious trauma when you're watching something and you're powerless to stop it. And the powerlessness talks about value. It talks about marginalization because the victims, there's a message that reinforces their lack of value. And that in the presence of privilege and power, there's nothing that they can do. So for a lot of them who I spoke to, I said, how did this resonate with you? Even women of color, how did this resonate with you? And they said, you know what? It was almost like a relief, not about the violence. And everyone kept saying it wasn't about the violence. It was about how far people went to make sure that this man was not alone. Right? Including a 6-year-old who jumped and swam. It was about making sure that on their watch that there was unity. That on their watch that they were going to stand up to oppression, stand up to racism, and they were going to hold people accountable. And they weren't going to let it be that we get this man off the ground and then that's over. They really decided to pursue it. And to make sure that the people wouldn't just get in their boat and leave, they really expressed displeasure. And the fight continued. And I remember during the fight, there was a mother or a sister who kept hitting all the African American men. And that somewhere down the line, an African American, and the men wouldn't hit her back, an African American woman jumped over the rail and said, I'm going to fight her because I know that we don't hit women, that a woman and a woman will have this exchange. But none of the men would touch her because one of the things that within our culture that we've learned as African American is that women are sacred. You don't speak back to your mama, you don't hit your mama, that she gets the respect. She's the nurturer, she's the provider of life. So for that woman to fight this woman or hold her accountable really says a lot. And this is the first time in history, other than the O.J. Simpson, where there's a sense of justice, even if the justice is momentarily. And I think psychologically, something happened on that day where there was a feeling of today we're not going to run. Today we're not going to hide. Today we're going to be unified and we're not going to act as if we don't see what we see. Because part of the coping mechanism that goes all the way back to slavery is when you see something wrong, when you see a slave dangling from a tree, you act like you don't see what you see. When you see a slave child being raped, you act like you see what you don't see. Because there are consequences of sin. So for many people, going back to slavery, they turn their head. They mind their business as a way of survival. So what happened on that day is that people chose to take a risk, to stand up, to give a voice. And it wasn't about violence. And I'm going to say again, I am not a proponent of violence. I think it was for them a moment of feeling empowered, a moment of coming together. And if you've been following me, the whole week I've been talking about Florida, about boycotting Florida. Because I know a lot of people have conferences in Florida. And for a lot of people, they're choosing not to go to those conferences. Some people said, what can we do? It's just one state. There's racism all over the place. Some people said, yeah, but boycotting doesn't make it better because racism is historical, and that boycotting one event won't make it go away. But can you imagine what would happen as a people, Black, white, Latino, Asian American, if we did what those people did, that when someone is in trouble, we wouldn't walk away. We would acknowledge it, and we would take that opportunity to say, today I'm going to stand in for what's right. I'm going to do the anti-racism thing, and I'm going to recognize when power and privilege are being abused and people are being treated as things and not as humans. Can you imagine what would happen if we all did that? And ironically, the men who couldn't come on, some of them said, I'm in a field where if I speak about this, it's like suicide. So then you get to hear again, there's the invisibility, there's that fear that there's no coveting on them. And that really goes back to talk about, you know, the socialization of fear amongst African American men who have been, who have been persecuted, just as similar to women, who have learned that the only way to stay safe is by not saying anything, by not snitching, by not talking, not complaining, by accepting what happens on many levels. And a very similar lesson is learned by women of color and Latinos and Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders, that we become adjusted or conditioned to being the receivers of harm, of being mistreated, unfairly spoken to, dishonored. And I think on that day, what we got to see is that there was collective people who said, not on my watch, not on today. And it wasn't about violence, it was about coming together to take a stand. It was in that belief that I am my brother's keeper. Because the videos that we've seen over the past 10 years of people of color being harmed, these are public these are public displays of violence. And many people have been hurt and murdered right in plain sight. And there has to be something to say about vicarious trauma. That when you live with trauma, you get used to trauma. You get used to being victimized, being violated. And what I loved about that moment is that the people who have been traumatized historically through the slave passages, through slavery, through the Jim Crow laws, decided that on that day they would be empowered. They would come together as a collective, as a whole, as a fist, to come help and not quite harm, but come help. And to do the thing that requires courage. But what saddens me is that many of the men that I spoke to in my circle, and my husband said I need to widen my circle, that there was some fear about coming off of retribution. Because even though they had strong feelings about it, there's still fear of being vulnerable, being outed, of having consequences, of telling your truth. And that saddens me because if one group is silent, then all of us are silent. So I would love to hear what many of you think about what could be a solution. Did you also see this as an act of standing up against oppression, an act of liberation, an act of advocacy? Could this have been a model that children can see? And when you see something wrong, when you stand up, there was this famous show. I forgot what it was on NBC. I think it was "What Would You Do?" And they had people who were laying on the floor, or people who would be picked at, or who would be marginalized, or um, would be um, the target of racism or biases. And people would watch this back and forth. People wouldn't interfere. And part of it is that it's part of a collusion, because if you're not saying something, if you're not stopping the sexism, the racism, the discrimination, the biasness, then you become part of a system. And the system doesn't change. All that changes is the date, because the subjugated members of society remain subjugated and oppressed, and the privileged members of society remain privileged and powerful, which is why this incident was so powerful. And for those people who said, "Oh, before I saw that incident, I saw the funny things, the memes." And this is the thing about laughter. Laughter helps us deal with something that's very painful. It's a coping mechanism. I used to work with the police department, and many times, we would see something and they would make a light joke because of the fact that it alleviates something. It takes some of the sting out of it. Because if the sting is not there, then what's underneath that is anger, is rage, is generational hurt, woundedness. And it's a reminder that some things have not changed. So I understand the people who said, "I felt bad about laughing, but it was funny." And by connecting it with the humor, it takes away from the significance of what happens. So it becomes like a skit on Saturday Night Live, where it's like, oh, it's wrong, but it's funny at the same time. But I want everyone to really lean in and look at what we've learned in this situation. And I want you to think about, what is your responsibility of stepping forward, of doing the right thing, of risking something. I applauded the fraternity Alpha Phi Alpha because they moved their conference out of Florida, as well as the Black engineers. Because for them, it wasn't about the money; it was about the principle. Because when all people are being discriminated, right, we all lose. We lose the ability to have fairness. We lose the ability to see Martin Luther King's dream materialize. And psychologically, we lose the ability to be repaired and to be restored. And then the trauma never ends, it continues. Because trauma ends when we feel empowered, when we feel as if we're good enough to have a say, when we can feel safe to get on this ear and talk about this topic without having to worry about, am I going to lose my job? Am I going to be blackballed? Am I going to be harmed? Because one of the things you get to see is that people were looking at themselves. And there are so many situations where they're the only someplace, where all they're trying to do is do their job. And then there's someone who might be doing some workplace bullying or doing some discrimination or some biasness. And they just have to experience it quietly because there's no one coming to their defense. And I think there was something beautiful and relieving to see that, wow, this man didn't have to go through this alone. And there's power in connection, because we're born in connection, right? The sperm and the egg. The egg connects to the uterus. It lives within the woman's body. When we're connected, we feel powerful. So I want to challenge each of you. Think in your community how you can be more connected, more courageous, more collective. Think about what you're willing to give up, what you're willing to risk. Because at that moment, all those people who came to that man, even the 6-year-old who swam, they were willing to risk something to make a change, to stand up. So I hope that you get something out of this. I hope that this continues conversations about, where race is at, where do you show up in changing it? What does anti-racism look like for you? Is it advocacy? Is it speaking out? Is it boycotting places? What does that look like for you? And is it being able to have some compassion for other people and what they go through? So much so that you you challenge people's racist thoughts, and you're looking at how it might show up in the workplace or in the school place, where there might be schools that are underperforming, and really looking at the disparity and bringing that attention to those disparities. I'm glad you were able to join me. Please feel free to post and share this to other people, because I think it's a good discussion, and I think it's worthy to continue it again. So I hope the next time I see you, we can have a part two and continue this again. Good to see you. Take care.